31st March 2020, 7:52 a.m. A quiet road on the edge of Lancashire. A hatchback rolling south, nothing unusual from a distance. But inside that car was a pattern that would eventually unravel a long-running operation. What happened next would soon become the decisive moment for a multi-million-pound drug network. A few months earlier, just after midday, a van eased through Bolton traffic, its false floor sealed tight. Hours earlier, on a small Leeds street, a black bin bag had changed hands in seconds, but both were unaware that officers were already closing in on both ends of the chain. And somewhere, around 2020, a shipment meant to land in one country drifted thousands of miles off course to another. Behind, the mistake was a man with links stretching far beyond Essex, a figure messaging frantically through an encrypted device trying to fix an error no one was supposed to see. 3 moments, 3 operations running on different scales, but each one left a trace, in cars, in houses, and in the form of digital conversations thought to be unbreakable. This is the story of how those traces were followed, how the doors eventually opened, and how the networks behind them were taken apart. Welcome to UK Crime Documentaries. Let's get straight into the case. Years earlier, in 2015, Richard and Patrick Gray had already stood in a Crown Court dock for a Class A conspiracy. Both men were convicted, both were handed confiscation orders, and both were warned about the consequences of returning to the world they had operated in. But by the time EncroChat phones began circulating through organised crime groups across the UK, the brothers were already back in motion. The warnings, the restrictions, even the asset seizures had not been enough to slow the route they had chosen. Their return wasn't noisy. There were no dramatic shifts in lifestyle, no sudden displays of wealth. Instead, the network built around them developed in the same quiet, methodical way their earlier operation had moved. They grew their reach through people they trusted, individuals who understood the expectation of silence, routine, and discipline. Richard, the older of the two, was placed by investigators at the center of the operations organization. Patrick moved alongside him, managing routes, arrangements, and guidance to those delivering or storing packages. Around them were the associates who helped keep the chain active. Muhammad Ali, a figure often noted for involvement in key exchanges, became a significant link within that structure. His role connected the brothers' instructions to the practical work carried out on the road. Alongside him was Lewis Court, someone used for regular movement, a runner whose presence in the chain helped shift cocaine from one staging point to another. William White too became one of the recurring names tied to the brothers' logistics. Each had a different level of responsibility, but all were part of the same moving system that kept the organization functioning quietly across counties. And then there was Sophie Plowman, whose flat became one of the key storage points within the network. Rather than operating at street level, she allowed Richard Gray to keep cocaine in her home. We will talk about this in a few minutes. And also permitted thousands of pounds in criminal cash to pass through her bank account, tying her directly to the conspiracy when officers searched the property. By the time officers began piecing the network together, the structure had already been running for months. But while the network carried on in the shadows, something else was already shifting behind the scenes. A quiet breakthrough that would turn their encrypted confidence into the very thing that exposed them. By early 2020, EncroChat had already settled into the daily operations of organised crime groups across the country, and the Greys were no exception. Richard Gray operated under the handle Cheetah Soda. It was a name that meant nothing outside the encrypted world, one of thousands used to shield identities behind layers of code and anonymity. From 31st March 2020, his device began producing the digital trail that investigators would later map, showing the frequency of exchanges, the consistency of his role, and the scale of the conspiracy. The messages contained details that were never meant to leave the network. The decoded messages gave investigators the language of the operation, but to understand its scale, they needed to see how those words translated onto the road. From the spring of 2020 through to May 2021, the Grey supply line moved steadily between the Northwest and the Midlands, forming a routine that blended into everyday traffic. It was this pattern, repetition, timing, and consistency that allowed officers to track the physical structure behind the encrypted communication. Regular cocaine runs were central to the chain. Vehicles traveled carrying loads that reflected the quantities later uncovered in the EncroChat threads, often 1 kilogram or 2 kilograms at a time, repeated across weeks and months. These weren't isolated deliveries. They were part of a continuous flow, each journey intended to maintain stock levels and meet demand across the region. The VW Golf became one of the key vehicles linked to these movements, a car that appeared repeatedly during surveillance periods and later searches. It was unremarkable in appearance, which made it well suited for the quiet, structured operation the brothers relied upon. Couriers handled most of the transport work. Each played a role in keeping the route active, collecting packages, handing them over, returning with cash, or moving stock between stash points. We will talk about this in a few minutes. Their movements, short trips, longer drives, repeated circuits, helped maintain the network's rhythm. Ali was often involved in collecting and transferring drugs or money. Court and White contributed to the steady flow of deliveries across counties. Their responsibilities varied, but all were part of the pipeline that kept the organization supplied. It was this consistency, the quiet regularity of trips that looked no different from other cars on the road, that allowed the network to operate for more than a year without disruption. But while the supply line moved with familiar precision, the places the drugs were taken to, the houses, the hideaways, the storage spots, would reveal even more about how the organization held itself together. As investigators mapped the Grey brothers' movements, the routes alone were not enough. The operation depended on physical spaces, locations where drugs were held, repackaged, or exchanged before the next courier arrived. These places became the backbone of the network's day-to-day functioning, each one tied to a different name, a different role, and a different level of responsibility within the conspiracy. One of the most significant sites was the farm near Farmore. It did not attract attention from the road, a rural setting detached from the flow of towns and cities. But inside, officers found the kind of evidence that linked the quiet exterior to the network's broader activity. The farm served as a storage point, a place used during the period when the supply line was at its most active. While the EncroChat messages provided the instructions, the farm provided the physical proof, reminders of the movement of multi-kilo cocaine shipments arriving from the Northwest. A second key location was the flat in Bodycote, used as a holding point within the chain. It sat closer to the areas where couriers made exchanges, allowing stock to be kept between runs before being moved on again. Investigators later connected this flat to individuals operating beneath the brothers, part of the structure that ensured deliveries continued even when the main supply line paused. Its role became more apparent once other addresses were searched and the same names began appearing across different locations. Further properties tied the network together. Homes linked to Lewis Court and William White helped place both men within the conspiracy. These addresses did not need large amounts of stock to carry evidential weight. It was the presence of items, connections to vehicles, and timings of visits that allowed officers to trace their roles in the movement of cocaine and cash. The most direct evidence came from the targeted searches carried out once the operation moved into its enforcement stage. We will talk about this in a few minutes. And once the places were identified, the next step was to capture the moments the network relied on most. The meetings, the handovers, and the journeys that revealed how the operation functioned in real time. By early May 2021, the investigation had reached a point where the evidence was no longer theoretical. What remained was the final step. Acting on the accumulated intelligence before the network could shift its structure or distance itself from the stash locations that had become central to the case. The last days before enforcement showed a familiar rhythm inside the organization. Lewis Court made one of his final recognized supply journeys, and Muhammad Ali continued with short visits to locations. Officers were positioned near the farm at Farmore, the flat in Bodycote, and the addresses tied to the associates who had kept the supply line active. When the enforcement phase began, it unfolded across several sites at once. Arrest teams approached the brothers' homes first, securing both Richard and Patrick Gray before they could move further stock or instruct others within the chain. Within moments, additional teams were entering the key properties. At Sophie Plowman's flat in Banbury, officers found 2.5 kilograms of cocaine hidden beneath a kitchen cabinet, along with equipment used to repackage the drug and evidence of over £24,000 in criminal cash laundered through her bank account. Across other linked properties and vehicles, officers recovered further quantities that brought the total seized to 2.8 kilograms of cocaine, alongside £158,000 in cash. The arrests of Court, Ali and White followed quickly, each taken at marked locations. The structure investigators had pieced together across a year of monitoring had been dismantled in a matter of hours, and with the organization taken apart, what followed moved from the roads and safe houses into the courtroom, where the full scope of the conspiracy would finally be set out in public. When the case finally reached Oxford Crown Court in January 2023, prosecutors presented the overwhelming evidence in full. At the center of that structure was Richard Gray. The court imposed a 21-year sentence. When the case later reached the Court of Appeal, the sentence was upheld. Judges confirmed that the term accurately reflected the seriousness of the offending and the evidence presented during the trial. Across all defendants, the judges noted the organized, sustained, and commercial scale of the operation. This was not a loose association of individuals, but a coordinated network built around routine, planning, and repetition. A structure that might have continued uninterrupted had the encrypted messages not revealed its full design. Along with his brother, Patrick Gray received a 15-year sentence beneath the brothers. The sentencing continued through the network. Muhammad Ali received 7 years and 6 months. Lewis Court was jailed for 8 years and 6 months. William White received 9 years. At the lower end of the chain, Plowman was sentenced to 5 years behind bars for her role in the conspiracy. But while the Gray brothers' network had been dismantled through months of encrypted evidence and surveillance, another operation, unfolding months earlier and counties away, had been unraveling under a very different kind of scrutiny. Thursday, 17th October 2019. A quiet street in Whinbrook Gardens, Leeds, nothing about the scene suggested the scale of what was about to pass between two vehicles. For investigators, though, this moment had already been marked. The movement of the Citroën Berlingo van, driven by Ashraf Khan, had been tracked as it made its way towards the location. A point in the timeline they already suspected was being used for exchanges linked to heroin distribution across the region. Ashraf arrived first, easing the van into position with the calm, unhurried manner of someone who had made similar stops before. Moments later, a grey Peugeot pulled up alongside him. Behind the wheel was Yusuf Kara, already under quiet scrutiny from the National Crime Agency as part of their work into Class A supply chains, feeding into Yorkshire and the Humber. To anyone on the street, it looked like nothing more than two vehicles pausing briefly before going their separate ways. Kara stepped out, opened the boot of his Peugeot, and lifted out a black bin bag, an ordinary domestic item that gave nothing away at a glance. Without hesitation, he placed it into the back of Ashraf's van. Within seconds, the exchange was complete. Kara returned to his vehicle. Ashraf closed the rear doors of the Berlingo. 2 men, 2 cars, and a bag that would later define the case. What neither man realized was that investigators had already been monitoring their movements. The NCA had been building an understanding of their routines, the locations they visited, the timing of their meetings, and the vehicles they relied upon. This exchange fitted the pattern, and officers watching understood that whatever passed between the two men would matter when the day's events later unfolded. And as the Berlingo left Leeds and travelled towards Bolton, officers prepared for the moment that would expose exactly what had been hidden inside that van. After leaving Leeds, Ashraf Khan's Citroën Berlingo made its way west towards Greater Manchester. The journey followed the familiar roads he had travelled before, but on this occasion, investigators were already aligned with his movements. As the Berlingo entered the area, officers from the National Crime Agency and supporting teams from local policing units initiated the stop. It unfolded without delay. Marked vehicles moved in, blocking the van's path, and officers approached with the clear purpose of securing both the driver and the vehicle before anything inside could be shifted, hidden, or passed on. Ashraf was detained at the roadside. For investigators, his identity was already known, and so was his past. His previous conviction for possession with intent to supply Class A drugs formed part of the background intelligence that had led to the increased scrutiny of his movements. This stop was not a coincidence. It was the result of a coordinated effort built on weeks of tracking contacts, vehicles, and interactions tied to the distribution chain. With Ashraf under arrest, officers turned their attention to the van. At first glance, the rear section appeared empty, the interior clean, and nothing immediately visible that suggested the scale of what had travelled from Leeds. But investigators were aware of the signs: discrepancies in the construction, subtle elevation in the flooring, and the weight distribution that did not match an empty vehicle. The Berlingo had been adapted. When officers lifted the concealed section, the false floor was exposed. Inside, they uncovered a large quantity of cash, estimated between £100,000 and £130,000, packed in bundles and wrapped for concealment. It was the confirmation of the Whinbrook Gardens exchange and the evidence that the bag had contained far more than either man had intended to reveal. During the search, investigators also seized multiple mobile phones, including a device identified as an EncroChat handset, a common tool within organised drug activity at the time. The handset, along with other phones found in Ashraf's possession, was later destroyed as part of the evidence process following the courtroom proceedings. And while Ashraf was being taken into custody, officers elsewhere were already moving toward the other half of the operation, the address where the drugs themselves were waiting to be found. The second half of the operation was already unfolding in West Yorkshire. Later that same day, Yusuf Kara was located travelling along Shearbridge Road in Bradford, a route he had used frequently and one that investigators had monitored during the wider inquiry. This time, however, the movement did not pass unnoticed. NCA officers, supported by West Yorkshire Police, moved in and carried out the arrest with the intention of preventing any chance of evidence being removed, relocated, or concealed. Once Kara was in custody, the focus turned immediately to his home address on Glendare Avenue, Lidget Green, a property already identified as a potential storage point within the supply chain. The search was authorized and executed without delay. Officers entered the house expecting significant evidence, but the scale of what was uncovered exceeded even the early intelligence assessments. Inside the property, investigators found bags and a suitcase filled with packages, each one consistent in size, wrapping, and weight. When the items were examined, the discovery became clear. 56 individual packages, each containing 1 kilogram of heroin, arranged and stored in a way that indicated ongoing distribution rather than temporary possession. The purity was not stated publicly, but the estimated street value was placed between £2.5 million and £3 million. For the investigation teams, the haul represented not just quantity, but confirmation of the structure they had been tracking. A supply line capable of moving multi-kilo loads and storing them in residential locations without drawing attention from the outside photographs taken during the search, later released by the National Crime Agency, showed the packages stacked in suitcases and bags laid out in rows that visually demonstrated the scale of the seizure. The images became central to the public understanding of the case. Once the operational phase was complete and both men were in custody, the investigation moved into the legal arena. Charges were issued quickly. Yusuf Kara faced the most serious allegations. Conspiracy to supply Class A, drugs and money laundering, offences tied directly to the 56 kilograms of heroin. Ashraf Khan was charged with money laundering. When the case was brought before Leeds Crown Court, prosecutors presented documentation detailing not only the seizures, but the financial benefit each defendant was assessed to have gained from the wider criminal activity. Under the Proceeds of Crime Act, POCA, these calculations form a crucial stage of proceedings, ensuring that individuals cannot retain profits derived from illegal operations, regardless of how much remains in their possession at the time of arrest. For Kara, the figures were significant. The court found that over the course of his involvement in the conspiracy, he had benefited by £1.09 million. However, when investigators examined his assets, the amount actually available to recover was far lower. His recoverable assets totaled £136,907, consisting of cash, vehicles, and designer goods. As a result, the confiscation order issued by the judge matched that figure exactly. As part of the ruling, Kara was also required to forfeit 2 vehicles, a Ford Focus and a Peugeot 207, both identified as being used in the movement of drugs and money across the network. The judge made clear that failure to pay the confiscation amount within the allotted time could result in an additional prison term of up to 16 months. A reminder that post-CA orders remain enforceable even after the end of a custodial sentence. Ashraf's financial assessment followed the same statutory process. His criminal benefit was set at £249,550, a figure derived from the movement of cash and his role within the transaction chain, but like Kara, his available assets were minimal. The court concluded that he possessed £2,669, the full amount of his recoverable assets, and issued a confiscation order for that sum. Between the charges, the benefit calculations, and the confiscation rulings, the court made clear that both defendants would face consequences extending beyond imprisonment. The financial dismantling of their gains was viewed as central to preventing continuation or re-establishment of similar criminal activity upon release. When sentencing was handed down, the courtroom brought together every strand of evidence gathered across the investigation. For Yusuf Kara, the judge imposed a sentence of 10 years and 4 months imprisonment, whereas for Ashraf Khan was sentenced for 28 months, or 2 years and 4 months, as reported across regional outlets. Together, the sentences and the financial penalties closed the case with a full account of responsibility, the drugs seized, the cash intercepted, and the roles each man played within the chain. And while this conspiracy was being taken apart, another, operating across borders and hidden behind encrypted devices, was already beginning to surface through international intelligence. In 2020, a shipment that was never supposed to draw attention became the entry point into a much larger investigation. The consignment, 30 kilograms of cocaine, had been arranged for delivery into Germany, part of a wider network of movements coordinated through encrypted communication. For the organizers behind it, the route, the timing, and the handover were all intended to operate quietly without drawing the slightest concern from authorities. But somewhere within the chain, a mistake was made, and the consequences shifted far beyond what any of them expected. Instead of reaching Germany, the shipment was redirected thousands of miles off course to South Africa for a network operating at high value and high risk. Such an error was catastrophic. The package drew suspicion almost immediately, and local authorities intercepted it before it reached its intended contacts. Once the cocaine was seized, the trail began to unravel. The seizure not only removed the product from circulation, but exposed a flaw in the network's overseas coordination, a flaw that investigators would later use to their advantage. What turned a failed shipment into a breakthrough for British authorities was the record left behind on EncroChat. Jonathan Parkhill, the man later dubbed the Escobar of Essex, trying to salvage the error. The tone of the exchanges was urgent. He attempted to coordinate new routes, correct the mix-up, and negotiate with contacts who were now demanding answers. What had been intended as a smooth transaction had become a problem he could not contain. The EncroChat material also set out something investigators had long suspected: Parkhill's links to high-level Colombian traffickers. The messages revealed coordination well beyond the UK's borders, showing that his role was not limited to domestic dealing but tied into international movement, supply chains, and financial agreements with groups operating at the upper end of the trafficking hierarchy. The 30-kilogram shipment was only one part of a broader pattern, but it was the mistake that began to break the pattern apart. Through the seizure, the messages, and the activity surrounding the botched consignment, the first clear picture of Parkhill's involvement began to form. It was the moment where a hidden network first became visible. And as investigators traced the fallout from the misrouted shipment, a second operation, larger in scale and even more revealing, was already taking shape overseas. While the fallout from the botched 30-kilogram shipment continued to ripple through the network, another operation, far more ambitious and far more revealing, was already underway. This second venture involved the attempted importation of over 500 kilograms of cocaine into Belgium, a quantity that placed it firmly in the upper tier of European trafficking. For investigators, it would become the most significant window into the scale and reach of Jonathan Parkhill's criminal activity. The plan, as reconstructed through EncroChat messages and later detailed in court, was structured around a high-value shipment with an estimated worth of £16 million to £90 million. Carrying out the operation required an on-the-ground contact in Belgium, and that responsibility fell to Kevin Hanley, Parkhill's long-standing associate. Messages later presented in court described Hanley as Parkhill's eyes in Antwerp, the man responsible for monitoring the arrival of the load, maintaining local contact, and handling any issues that emerged during the transfer. His position made him central to the success of the operation, but it also placed him in the line of fallout when things went wrong, and things did go wrong. As with the 30-kilogram shipment, this attempt did not unfold as planned. The details of the failure were not fully disclosed publicly, but what was clear, from both sentencing reports and multiple news outlets, was that the deal collapsed completely. The shipment never reached its intended channel. The money did not flow back to the Colombian groups involved, and accountability within the criminal hierarchy was immediate. Hanley became the target of that accountability. Reports confirmed that he was beaten in Antwerp after the collapse, punished by those expecting the operation to succeed and demanding an explanation for the loss. The violence underscored the level at which both men were operating. These were not local disputes or small-scale drug movements. They were dealing with suppliers whose expectations were backed by significant financial risk and the capacity for serious retaliation. And as the two operations began to unravel, the pressure around Parkhill intensified, leading to the arrest that finally brought his role in the network to an end. Behind the scenes, a much larger development had begun shifting the balance between organized crime and law enforcement. In early 2020, the encrypted communications platform EncroChat was secretly compromised. That breach led directly to Operation Venetic, and I will not go into those details. You have already pretty much understood after watching so many of the cases. Among the thousands of handles identified was the activity belonging to Jonathan Parkhill, whose communications with Colombian suppliers and UK-based associates laid out the structure of his involvement. By the time the intelligence around his movements was complete, Parkhill's return to the UK presented a narrow but decisive opportunity. In 2021, after flying back from Colombia, he landed at Heathrow Airport, unaware that investigators were already positioned to intercept him. His arrest was immediate, forming one of the more significant detentions associated with the Venetic response in that period. In West London, enforcement officers moved on his associate, Kevin Hanley. He was detained near his home in Uxbridge, where a sawn-off shotgun was discovered during the search of the property. The weapon was not the focus of the trafficking investigation, but its presence added weight to the string of other offences that both men later admitted in court. It also reflected the level of risk often present within networks operating at this scale. Both Parkhill and Hanley were charged with conspiracy to import cocaine alongside additional offences linked to their criminal activity revealed through the EncroChat material. With the arrests secured and the evidence laid out, the final stage of the investigation moved into the courtroom, where the sentences would reflect both the scale of the operations and the reach of the network behind them. When the case reached Isleworth Crown Court, the evidence gathered under Operation Venetic was presented in its final form. Both Jonathan Parkhill and Kevin Hanley had already entered guilty pleas to conspiracy to import cocaine, along with a series of additional offences. What remained was the question of the sentence. Parkhill received a sentence of 16 years imprisonment for his role, whereas Kevin Hanley was sentenced to 11 to 11.5 years, with slight variation in reporting across national outlets, but consistently within that range. What do you think about the cases and the sentences? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your take. And if you found this breakdown informative, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next episode of UK Crime Documentaries.